In this episode, we're going to treat identity as the control plane of cloud security and not as a boring administrative detail, because identity sprawl is one of the fastest ways a well-meaning organization quietly becomes unsafe. When teams move quickly in the cloud, they create users, roles, service accounts, keys, and integrations as if they are disposable. And that habit seems harmless until it becomes impossible to answer basic questions about who has access and why. Identity and Access Management, IAM, is the system that defines who can do what, but the real lesson is that poor IAM design creates security problems even when nobody is trying to be reckless. Attackers love identity sprawl because it hides overprivilege, creates forgotten pathways, and makes monitoring noisy and unreliable. By the end, you should be able to explain what identity sprawl looks like, why it emerges so easily, and how to build foundations that stay sane as teams and workloads multiply. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Identity sprawl is best understood as uncontrolled growth in the number of identities and the number of permission paths, combined with unclear ownership and weak lifecycle discipline. It includes obvious things like too many user accounts and too many service accounts, but it also includes subtler problems like roles that overlap, policies that duplicate each other, and permissions that were granted for a short-term need and never removed. In cloud environments, sprawl is especially dangerous because a single identity can potentially touch many services, and many services can be controlled through the same centralized identity system. Beginners sometimes assume that sprawl is just untidiness, like a messy desktop, but it is more like an expanding set of doors you forgot you installed. When you cannot confidently say which doors exist, you also cannot confidently secure them. Good IAM foundations are about limiting the number of doors, labeling them clearly, and ensuring they open only for the right people at the right times. A key reason sprawl happens is that identity creation in the cloud is easy, and ease encourages short-term fixes that become long-term structures. A team needs access to deploy something by the end of the day, so someone grants a broad role rather than designing a precise one. A vendor integration needs permissions, so an administrator creates a service identity with more access than necessary because it is faster than figuring out the minimum. A project ends, but the identities and permissions remain because removing them feels risky and nobody wants to break something unexpectedly. Over time, these decisions pile up into an environment where access is wide, poorly documented, and hard to audit. This is not a moral failure. It is a predictable outcome of speed without structure. Understanding that sprawl is a systemic outcome helps you design systems that resist it rather than blaming individuals after the fact. The first foundational move that prevents sprawl is anchoring identity in a central authority rather than allowing every account or workload to become its own identity island. In many cloud designs, there is a top-level identity domain that acts as the root of trust, where users and groups are managed and where authentication is integrated. When identities are centralized, onboarding and offboarding become consistent, and you avoid the situation where the same person has multiple accounts scattered across environments. Central identity also makes it easier to enforce baseline authentication requirements and to track access changes over time. Beginners sometimes think decentralization makes teams more independent, but in identity, decentralization often produces duplication, inconsistent policy, and delayed access removal. Centralization is not about control for control's sake. It is about having one place where the truth about identities lives. Once you have that truth, you can delegate access safely because delegation is grounded in consistent identity. Once identity is centralized, the next foundation is building access around roles rather than around individuals, because direct permission assignment is one of the strongest accelerators of sprawl. Role-based design means you define a small set of roles that map to job responsibilities or workload functions, and you assign people to those roles rather than crafting one-off permissions for each person. This approach matters because it creates reuse and it makes audit questions answerable, since you can review a role once and understand what every member can do. Beginners often prefer direct permissions because it feels precise, but it becomes unmanageable as soon as the team grows or reorganizes. Roles also support safer change, because if a permission needs to be adjusted, you change the role definition instead of chasing individual exceptions. The high-level mechanics are simple. Roles hold permissions, people and services assume roles, and governance reviews roles on a schedule. When this is done well, access becomes an intentional design artifact rather than a patchwork of historical decisions. A common beginner misunderstanding is believing that roles must be extremely specific to the point of creating hundreds of tiny roles, which can actually reintroduce sprawl in a different form. A more durable approach is to design roles that are minimal but meaningful, covering real job duties without adding unrelated power. If roles are too broad, they become risky. If roles are too narrow and too numerous, they become confusing and people start requesting exceptions constantly. The goal is to find stable role boundaries that match how work is actually performed, then refine gradually as you learn. When a role is well designed, it becomes a reusable contract that survives team changes, because the role describes responsibilities, not individuals. This is why role design is not a one-time event. It is an evolving model that must remain small enough to manage and clear enough to trust. A clean role catalog reduces both human error and attacker opportunity by keeping the access model understandable. Non-human identities, such as service accounts and automation roles, deserve their own foundation rules because they grow faster than human identities and are easier to forget. Workloads need identities to call cloud services. Deployment systems need identities to create resources. Monitoring tools need identities to read logs. And integrations need identities to exchange data. If you let every application team create service identities without standards, you end up with an environment full of mysterious accounts that nobody claims, but many systems depend on. Preventing this requires high-level controls like required naming conventions that reflect purpose, ownership, and environment, along with mandatory documentation that describes why the identity exists and what it must access. It also requires rules about how credentials are managed, because long-lived keys for service identities can become persistent attacker assets if they are leaked. At a conceptual level, you want each service identity to be boring and predictable, with a narrow purpose and a clear owner, because predictability is what makes anomalies visible. Lifecycle management is the next foundation because identity sprawl is not only about creation, it is also about failure to remove and failure to update. A cloud environment changes constantly, and people change jobs, projects end, and vendors rotate, which means access should change too. If access persists indefinitely, privilege creep becomes inevitable, and privilege creep creates privilege escalation paths for attackers. Lifecycle management means onboarding is structured, role assignment is documented, and offboarding is immediate and verifiable, not based on someone remembering to remove access later. It also means periodic reviews of access to ensure roles still match current duties, which is especially important for long-lived accounts and privileged roles. Beginners sometimes fear access reviews because they worry they will break things, but the alternative is running a cloud environment where nobody knows what access is safe to remove. Reviews do not need to be chaotic. They can be planned, staged, and supported by evidence of actual usage. Least privilege is often described as a principle, but for IAM foundations it must be treated as a design method, because vague commitment does not stop sprawl. Designing least privilege means you start from what a role must do and you add only the actions required to perform that work, resisting the urge to include wildcards or broad actions for convenience. The cloud makes broad permissions especially risky because a permission that seems harmless in one context might be powerful in another service. Beginners often believe that broad permissions are safer because they prevent operational problems, but broad permissions actually create security problems that are harder to detect and harder to contain. A least privilege approach also makes incident response easier, because the scope of a compromised identity is naturally limited. Over time, least privilege becomes easier when roles are designed with clear purpose and when teams accept that small friction is preferable to large risk. This is where good foundations quietly change culture because people stop expecting unlimited access as the default. Separation of duties is another structural protection that keeps identity systems from becoming a single point of catastrophic failure. In cloud identity models, the most dangerous situation is when one identity can both perform operational tasks and modify the rules that govern those tasks, such as changing policy definitions or disabling logging. If an attacker compromises such an identity, they can expand access and hide evidence quickly. Separation of duties means that sensitive governance actions are reserved for specific roles, while day-to-day operational tasks are performed by different roles, and the overlap is intentionally limited. Beginners sometimes think this will slow work, but in practice it can speed work by making responsibilities clearer and reducing the number of people who need high privilege. It also reduces mistakes, because fewer people have the ability to make high-impact changes. The high-level mechanism is simple. You divide powers so that no single compromised identity can easily rewrite the rules of the environment. As the identity model grows, naming and documentation become security controls because they make the environment legible to humans, and humans still make the decisions that determine risk. When identities and roles are poorly named, teams create duplicates because they cannot tell whether a role already exists for a purpose. When roles are undocumented, people request broad access because they cannot understand what a narrower role provides. Clear naming conventions communicate scope and intent, while lightweight documentation captures the purpose, owner, and review expectations for each role and service identity. This is not about producing a book of policies nobody reads. It is about providing enough clarity that access decisions remain deliberate. Attackers thrive in ambiguity because ambiguity hides misuse. Legibility is defensive because it makes it easier to detect abnormal access patterns and easier to audit whether permissions match responsibilities. Monitoring is what keeps IAM foundations honest over time, because even well-designed roles can be misused or misassigned, and even disciplined teams can make mistakes under pressure. Identity monitoring focuses on events that change power, such as creation of new identities, modification of policies, assignment of privileged roles, and unusual authentication patterns. The goal is not to generate endless alerts, but to create high-signal visibility into the actions that expand capability. A beginner mistake is assuming that monitoring replaces strong role design, when the truth is that monitoring works best when the identity model is clean. When roles are predictable, unusual changes stand out. When roles are messy, everything looks unusual, and defenders start ignoring signals. Good foundations therefore improve monitoring outcomes by reducing noise and making significant identity events more meaningful. Automation is the practical glue that keeps identity discipline from collapsing as the environment scales, because manual enforcement cannot keep up with rapid growth. Automation can standardize role creation, enforce naming rules, prevent direct permission grants outside approved pathways, and trigger reviews when identities have not been used for a period. It can also ensure that onboarding assigns roles based on defined job functions rather than based on ad hoc requests. The high-level idea is that if a rule is important, it should be enforceable by system design rather than reliant on memory. Beginners sometimes fear automation because it feels complex, but automation is often the simplest way to keep a small set of rules applied consistently. When identity workflows are automated, sprawl becomes harder to create accidentally, which is exactly what you want in a fast-moving environment. Automation turns good intentions into repeatable outcomes. Privileged access deserves a final foundation layer because high-privilege identities are the crown jewels of cloud control planes, and sprawl at the privileged level is especially dangerous. A durable IAM foundation keeps privileged roles rare, time-limited where possible, and heavily monitored, while ensuring that emergency access paths exist but are tightly controlled. If privileged access is treated casually, then every admin account becomes an attractive target and every compromise becomes a potential full environment event. If privileged access is treated as a special capability with explicit process, the environment becomes more resilient because escalation paths are narrower and more visible. Beginners often think the solution is simply to trust administrators, but trust is not a control, design is. When privileged identities are protected by structure, the environment can withstand mistakes and compromise far better. This sets up the next step in IAM maturity, where roles become tightly aligned to duties and permission creep is continuously removed. At a high level, building IAM foundations that prevent identity sprawl means designing identity as a controlled system that scales, rather than as a series of access fixes made one request at a time. Centralized identity authority reduces duplication, role-based access replaces direct grants, service identities are standardized and owned, and lifecycle management ensures access changes with reality. Least privilege and separation of duties limit attacker power even after compromise, while naming discipline and documentation keep the model legible. Monitoring and automation keep the model healthy as the environment grows, and privileged access is treated as a special risk domain rather than as a convenience. On the exam, this way of thinking helps you choose answers that reduce sprawl and strengthen governance rather than answers that merely add another permission. In real cloud defense, these foundations make the difference between an environment that stays understandable under growth and one that becomes so messy that even well-intentioned defenders cannot confidently secure it.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.